Patti Callahan Henry is a New York Times, EPCA Christian Publishing, Globe and Mail, and USA Today best-selling author of 16 novels. She's also a podcast host, and one of those podcasts explores the background of her novel Becoming Mrs. Lewis, the improbable love story of Joy Davidman and C.S. Lewis. Many of our speakers here at Oxbridge have been on the podcast with Patti. Her novel, Once Upon a Wardrobe, released last October, explores the stories in C.S. Lewis's life that we might see hidden in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Patti is the recipient of the Christie Award Book of the Year, the Harper Lee Distinguished Writer of the Year, and the Alabama Library Association Book of the Year for Becoming Mrs. Lewis. She is the co-host and co-creator of the popular weekly online Friends and Fiction live web show and podcast. She's published in numerous anthologies and short story collections, and her newest novel, The Secret Book of Flora Lee, set here outside Oxford in the hamlet of Binsey, will be released on May 2nd in 2023 with Simon & Schuster. Please give a warm welcome to Patti Callahan Henry.
Everything sounds better when Kristen says it. Like you read that and you're like, blah, blah, and then she says it. Before we get started, I know that we're running a little late, so I promise. Oh my gosh, we're exactly on time. I really want to say, volunteers, Steve, Chris, Amber, the sound people, you are here when we get here, and you're here when we leave. I see you. Thank you. Thank you. All right, y'all. Hear the whole world. Stars, water, air, and field and forest, as they were reflected in a single mind. C.S. Lewis wrote those words about his beloved wife, Joy Davidman. I know my husband loves me, but he hasn't written anything like that. Reflected in a single mind. I posit that their whole love story began because of intellectual hospitality on Joy Davidman's part. What if, let's just imagine, let's hit our imagination here. What if you are willing enough, desperate enough, curious enough to hear the story you think you know from a different angle? Isn't that what intellectual hospitality is from the very beginning? All of these speeches this week, the songs, the music, the poetry, they have all fed what I always describe and imagine as the river beneath the river. The unseen part of us, the part of us that really changes in intellectual hospitality. The unseen, the river beneath the river. Everything this week has fed into that. And I hope this morning that our conversation of joy and Jack and creative writing can feed into that river in a new way. So I want to start with a poem. And I want to for a lot of reasons. One, because poetry is very important to me, but also for exactly what Matthew just said. It creates an opening for us. Poetry often to me is a doorway to be able to hear and soften and listen beyond our usual logic and logos. This is a poem by William Stafford, and it echoes back to a poem that Malcolm read on our sonnet night about beginning, starting here, beginning here. And it's a poem I memorized for my daughter's wedding and have promptly unmemorized. So I'm going to read it. Starting here, what do you want to remember? How sunlight creeps along the shining floor, what scent of old wood hovers, what softened sound from outside fills the air. Will you ever bring a better gift for the world than the breathing respect that you carry wherever you go right now? Are you waiting for time to show you some better thoughts? Are you waiting for time to show you some better thoughts? When you turn around, starting here, lift this new glimpse that you have found. Carry into evening all that you want from this day. Carry into evening all that you want from this day. This interval you spent reading or hearing all of this from everybody, keep it for life. Because what can anyone give you greater than now, starting here, right in this room, when you turn around? Isn't that beautiful? So let's start there, right here in this room. We're going to talk about the written word with intellectual hospitality in two ways. One, intellectual hospitality is curiosity that emerges from reading the written word, and then intellectual hospitality offered by us as the writer in the written word with honesty and emotional vulnerability. Could it be possible that one of the many definitions of intellectual hospitality can be sourced from one of my favorite quotes by Joy Davidman, C.S. Lewis's wife? If we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us? If we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us? And I love this question for loads of reasons. One of them because she was brave enough to ask it, but also because where she chose to put the language. Should we ever grow brave? Meaning we might not be there yet. What should become of us? Because we are constantly, by what we hear, by what we participate in this week, by what we try to understand, we are becoming. So if we should ever grow brave, what should become of us? So is it possible that intellectual hospitality, among many of the definitions, is being brave enough to consider new ways of living and thinking through the written word? New ways of living that lead us to a wider life, a more vulnerable life, a more intimate life, and in the story I'm about to tell you, even love. The English poet David Whyte talks about the beautiful question, and we've talked about that here in different ways, but he says that the beautiful question can either make or unmake a life. Isn't that amazing? And sometimes we need our life to be made, and sometimes we need it to be unmade. And so the beautiful question isn't always about hearing what we want to hear, but about either making or unmaking a life and being able and willing to ask those questions. And that's what I feel like intellectual hospitality is. He has a poem called Coleman's Bed. It's about an altar and a well in Ireland. And one of the lines in that poem says, "Make yourself a door through which to be hospitable." And here's the clincher: even to the stranger in yourself. Make a door through which to be hospitable, even to the stranger in yourself. And that's what I think the written word can be for us if we're open. Earlier in the week, Andrew asked us, who is your stranger? What if it's ourselves? What if we don't really know? Like we talked about earlier, what if we're saying the creed, but we don't know? We're just saying it. So can we be hospitable enough to open the door to the stranger in ourselves? Richard Rohr talks about deep listening, but I'm going to pretend that the word listening says reading. So I hope he will forgive me for inserting the word reading. Deep reading is an act of surrender. We risk being changed by what we read. When I really want to hear another person's story, I try to leave my preconceptions at the door and draw near to their telling. He also says, though, that by listening or reading, this doesn't validate them, it just lends them some humanity. And are we willing to do at least that? So I'm going to tell you a story of intellectual hospitality. Why a story? We have talked about intellectual hospitality from science. I just was grasping onto that talk, like with both hands. We've talked about it from politics, we've talked about it with music and pain and Lewis's works. But today, right now, I want to talk about it in the written and reading the written word and writing the written word. Why a story? Once upon a time. Don't you just lean forward? Don't you just want to know what happens next when you say once upon a time? That's because we are made for story. We are quite literally wired for story. Of the 8 billion brain cells that we have, some of us less now, they are after one thing: control and meaning. I'm not talking about our hearts, I'm talking about our heads. They are constantly after, our minds, our brain cells are after control and meaning and connections. And what better way is there to make meaning of the meaningless and sense of the senseless than through story? Diana's talk moved all of us so much. We were taking notes. We were furiously scribbling. How can we use this in our personal lives? What is intellectual hospitality? But when did we all cry? When she told the story at the end. Logic helps us. Story moves us to action. Story moves our hearts and our minds. Myth and legend and storytelling and poetry and song, I believe, are ancient paths that have reached our inner psyches, our inner lives, and our hearts for all time. What Malcolm or Matthew says in one line, it takes some of us 400 pages of a novel. And what did Lewis call this? I want to hear the chorus. Sneaking past our watchful dragons. That is what story does. So with that suggestion that these things might be intellectual hospitality, once upon a time, there was a woman named Joy Davidman, a genius, unarguably. You can argue with me about other stuff, but not that. A genius, an award-winning poet, an atheist, a wife, a mother, a communist, and eventually and unexpectedly, a wife to the beloved C.S. Lewis. It was all so improbable, this married atheist with 2 children, but I believe that it is in part due to Aslan, but in part to do with intellectual hospitality on both of their sides. Their willingness to engage in the bigger questions, to open themselves to the stranger within themselves, and therefore to the stranger in each other. They were trying, as I mentioned before, to make sense of the senseless and meaning of the meaningless. Most of us know the story, so I'll summarize quickly, but Joy Davidman was married with 2 young children, alone in New York in her apartment, when her husband, Bill, who was an alcoholic and had PTSD from the Spanish Civil War, had called and threatened suicide and said he probably wasn't coming home that night. Joy Davidman, the atheist, who believed herself the captain of her soul, literally, found herself on her knees. And she was confused. Why am I on my knees? Why am I praying? There's no one to pray to. And she says, in her words, I always get chills when I tell this story, there was 30 seconds when the world cracked open and God came in. She said that she realized that everything she had founded her life on before was unable to help her navigate her life now. One of my favorite quotes of hers is that logic was not enough to navigate the world anymore. How can she navigate a world with logic alone? So she began a deep dive into religion. That wasn't her conversion moment. That wasn't the moment that she got down on her knees and said the sinner's prayer. And people want to know when that moment is. But for her, this was very much like the moment at Addison's Walk, where she finally believed, okay, there is something greater than me. What is that? And she remembered reading the work of a man named C.S. Lewis. At this time, I'm going to put you in historical perspective. This is 1947, 48, and Lewis has been on the cover of Time magazine. Chad Walsh has written Apostle to the Skeptics in the Atlantic magazine, and she has read a number of the books he has read. He has not yet published Narnia, so that is not what he is famous for at the time. So she starts to read his work. And so the first step, I argue, in this relationship of intellectual hospitality is what I call in the margins. In the Wade Center at Wheaton, there is a copy of The Problem of Pain that belonged to Joy Davidman. And she has written in all the margins, having a conversation with Lewis before she ever had a conversation with him. I'm going to read you some of the things she wrote in the margin because I think they're astounding. In the section where Lewis argues that freedom and self-consciousness are the same thing, she writes, "I agree with you," as if he's there, as if he can read what she is writing to him in the margin. She is already participating out of curiosity, and let's be honest, desperation, but she's already hospitable to his ideas that are anathema to her. She writes in the margins that there's only one way to be happy, and that's love. All else are uneasy frauds. Already she is engaging with his work, with her own beliefs. She writes numerous notes in the margins about her husband, Bill, how he can never be a Christian because he refuses to show shame. She is trying to have a conversation with Lewis only from his written word. That's it, from his written word. She's open to it. In another place she writes, a bad metaphor, I think. All right, I don't think I would have said that to Lewis. She even asks him questions in the margin. What if you have already surrendered and the pain grows worse? She asks him this in the margins of his own book. If the initiative lies with God and he chooses not to exercise it, he is a devil. Some of the initiative must lie with us. She is trying to reason it out. She's trying to work her way through by being hospitable to his words. She is curious. She is open. Then she unloads her heart to him in the margins. I wished only that my parents would have admitted what they had done to me and repent. Apology would have been revenge enough. Yes, Joy J. Davidman talked to Jack before she even met him. Then next, step 2 in this story of intellectual hospitality, Joy started to write him letters. Her first letter was in January of 1950. We have no idea, sadly, what these letters say. They've all been lost to time, unless when Douglas passes, there's a sudden box of letters. But for now, they're all gone. What we do know is a line in Warney's diary that says, "We have received a letter from the most fascinating American woman." So whatever she said was fascinating enough for them to start an almost 3-year pen friendship. When we go back and forth with letters, with time passed, I wrote this down when Sherry was talking about leaving space before we react. When we go back and forth with time passed, so we can absorb what the other letter said and think through it without reacting, isn't that hospitable? So much that's inhospitable today seems to be the quick reactions we have, online and in person. But writing letters gives us space to absorb what they said and then respond in kind. And that is what they did for almost 3 years. Another Rohr quote, "Compassion and humility don't give us a sense of control or psychic comfort. Compassion and dialogue are essentially vulnerable positions." And they were both willing in these letters to be vulnerable. If we are into control, who of us is into control? Come on. If we're into control and predictability, we will seldom descend into the vulnerability of undefended listening. Undefended listening. That is what they were doing in their letters. And although we don't have the letters, both Joy and Jack were incredibly educated and very careful with their language. So I can guarantee that these letters did not contain slovenly, lazy name-calling. How else could they have grown so close over almost 3 years of letters? Maybe we should just go back to that. Next up in this relationship of intellectual hospitality, they are face to face. Joy travels alone to England in the year of 1953 and visits him for the first time. Andrew and I will talk about this in our breakout session. There are debates when they first met, but I think he's figured it out. But either way, they met in September of 1953. But let's not sugarcoat it. Let's not sugarcoat it. She overwhelmed him. It is said by her that she made a pass at Christmas and repented for having stayed too long. And he said of his wife that he wrote, "Everything is reflected in a single mind. I was plagued by a guest who talks from morning till night." So Diana tells us that intellectual hospitality must have boundaries, and obviously Joy violated those. But she went home to New York, and Lewis gave her space again, and the letters began again. Lewis has said about the written word, and I'm sure it was with these letters, "My own eyes are not enough for me, so I must see through other eyes. My own eyes are not enough for me, so I must see through other eyes." We're still here in the written word and her letters. Then he made space, and she came back. Now, there's another hidden element of intellectual hospitality that's one of my favorites, actually, and is going to echo back to knowing the stranger in ourselves, and that's Joy's sonnets. Joy began to write sonnets during this time, trying to understand what she was going through, trying to understand what this hospitable and intellectual relationship meant, because once again, let's not sugarcoat it, she was in love. She didn't write all of them after she met him. Some of them she wrote before she met him, but she eventually put all of them together in a package of 45 love sonnets. So I am not a poet. That's our friend Malcolm's Rain. But I do know that the sonnet is a very structured poem. You are kept to a very strict cadence, number of lines, where you start, where you end, and how certain lines must echo back. And she used, I find it fascinating that instead of free verse, these sonnets about how she felt and trying to open herself to Lewis's ideas, she put strict boundaries around them. She put it in sonnet form. She didn't write long, flowery love letters to make him love her back. These were private until she gave them to him. She writes in the cover letter, "Dear Jack," this is after all 45 of them have been assembled. "The trouble with them, as I think you'll see, it's that I do the trick too easily." I'm not looking at Andrew, but he's mouthing with me. "In 15 seconds from desire to deed. Still I have made such and such rhymes in your honor, sir, and here's the lot. And if you think the sum of it not much, remember, it's the only gift I've got." Talk about hospitality. As our slang has it, funny as a crutch. The verse may be a joke. The love is not. And to quote the expert on this, one of, Don W. King, he writes, these sonnets offer stunning evidence of David Min's spiritual struggles with regard to her feelings for Lewis, her sense of God working on her selfishness, demanding, love-starved, and lonely life. It's the vulnerability in these sonnets that I believe is hospitable. In one of my favorites, she begins with, you can feel this head to toe. "Begin again. Must I begin again? Who have begun so many loves in fire and ended them in dirty ash?" That's vulnerable. That's hospitable. So the next step in this emotionally hospitable relationship is that they begin to write together. Can you imagine anything more hospitable than writing together? What Diana and all of us call bandersnatching is what they were doing. He was even having her answer some of his letters as their friendship grew. She moved to England. She had her 2 sons. When he received a letter that he thought she was better, oh no, I just got my sign, that she thought she was better at answering, he let her answer those letters. And they wrote, as we'll talk about in the breakout, they co-wrote Till We Have Faces Together. She says, though I can't write 1/10 as well as Jack, I can tell him how to write more like himself. Can you imagine anything more hospitable than to have, you love someone so much that you're willing to help them write more like themselves. The next step, of course, is Eros. And as we all know, she passes away early. There's a Damocles sword hanging over their head from the day they married to the day they died. And from the quote Yancey put up, we know that it was also not only the happiest, but in many ways the most peaceful and joyful time of their lives. And then she, spoiler alert, she dies. And the intellectual hospitality continues, because what does Lewis do? He writes a grief observed. He opens his veins and pours blood on the page to show us the emotional vulnerability of grief, what it felt like. When he says, I never knew grief felt so like fear, we know that we're in the hands of someone we can trust. We realize that we're involved with intellectual hospitality. In Joy and Jack's story, it's as if Joy and Jack read Diana's working definition. When persons of goodwill seek to engage with one another with the goal of greater understanding. So here we have a story of intellectual hospitality with two very real people, from in the margins to death. And I want you to consider this. Without Joy's intellectual hospitality, or her desperate need that opened her to curiosity and raw honesty, would we have Till We Have Faces? Would we have the seminal book on grief, A Grief Observed? How different would the last decade of Lewis's life be without her? Scholars can debate the answer to that, but what is clear is that his work is different because one woman was willing to be intellectually hospitable and one man in return. So I want to talk now just a little bit about, my favorite thing is to open this up for conversation, but a little bit about then how does that translate from reading with intellectual hospitality to writing with international? There you go. And should I have one more cup of tea? How can we, as a poet, a nonfiction writer, a creative fiction writer, a fairy tale writer, a songwriter, a novelist, how can what we write be considered intellectual hospitality? As a novelist, I believe that any creative writing requires intellectual hospitality to get out of our own way, to get behind someone else's eyes, a made-up person or a very real person like Joy Davidman. Is it possible that intellectual hospitality on the whole, as in creative writing, is literally getting out of our own way, somehow transcending our ego, our well-thought-out defenses, the ones we have in our head while they're talking, our people-pleasing, and our thoughts of, well, ourselves? And for me, creative writing, it must be done there too. I want to start with a man's words whose source is from that river beneath the river, our own Malcolm. He read from the poem Hospitality the other night, and when he read this line, I scribbled it as fast as I could. And then I went back to the computer and read the poem over and over, but it is this line that describes exactly what I'm trying to describe in creative writing by getting out of our own way and trying to see the world from another person's point of view. He's talking about words, and he says, I make them free of all that is mine. I make them free of all that is mine, and they are good to me, the words. And I'm going to do what I did with Roar and put in another word, a story. I make a story free of all that is mine, and it is good to all of us. When I approached Joy's life, I aimed to do it from the seat of empathy. writing from behind her eyes, from the seat of her heart. There were many times when Joy did something I would not have done. Decisions I knew some people would not like. Possibly, it's only possible they might write to me angrily about it, as if I did it. And yet, if I was not honest about her life, if I fashioned her life or anyone else's life in my image or my own making, how hospitable is that? Wouldn't you feel the hidden lie? I believe you would. I believe you would feel the hidden, I'm trying to make her or myself look better, instead of being vulnerable and honest about what it was. Patrick O'Tuma says that every story is both a revelation and a concealment. Don't you love that? Every story is both a revelation and a concealment. He also has an essay where he says that there's a theory that there are 7 plots in the world. Some say there are only 3 plots. He says there's one, and it's a question, and the question is, who am I? That every song, every story, every lecture, every conversation, we are coming back again and again to this question, who am I? And I believe that who am I, when we answer that, we are also answering it for others. We are exploring what it means to be human. In story, in poetry, in song, in essays, we are trying to be whole-making. We are not trying to fake it. If we are, it's not going to help anybody, and it's not hospitable to the soul. How can we invoke the divine if we can't get out of our own way? Aren't we always trying to get back to the truth? Who am I? Which also answers, who are you? All of these means are from the same well. The ability and curiosity and willingness to open your mind and heart to something other than what you think you already know. And for me, much of that takes place in both reading and writing. One of my favorite quotes sits on my desk right now. Our failure is to have traded the experience of the divine for the fantasy of control. Our failure is to have traded the experience of the divine for the fantasy of control. So let's not do that. Let's not trade the experience of the divine for the experience of control. Thank you.